now that we are ready to weaponize interdependence, I'm hoping we can start with a conversation about choke points, which has come up a few times today, but hoping we can address head-on in the technology competition right now. What are the most important choke points? Who controls them? And which ones might we be missing? What are the choke points of tomorrow?
Sure, well, I think that the first part of that question is easier to answer, so let's start there. It won't surprise anyone to hear that I think that the chip sector, and in particular advanced computing, is the critical choke point on the US side, or let's say vis-a-vis China. Whereas the other way, as has been demonstrated very clearly over the last few months, it is the, let's say, critical minerals, and especially the processing element of that. As to what emerges in future, I think that it will expand our understanding of what a choke point is. And we'll come to this, but the reason for that is that as, let's say, that first choke point slowly breaks down and the Chinese industry develops the capacity to substitute these technologies, you will see an increasing presence of Chinese AI-enabled technology, robotics, and new renewable energies, etc., overseas. And that will provide many more points of leverage for potentially the Chinese government compared to a single exquisite technology. So the future of choke points, I would suggest, is not going to look like an ASML exquisite machine. It is going to look like a very distributed network of points in which Chinese technology and potentially, let's say, US or Japanese, Korean technology, European possibly, will provide points of leverage. If we think back to the keynote speech and to the graphs that Peter drew for us, it is much more about networks going forwards rather than single nodes and single hierarchical relationships.
And so I think, we've grown accustomed, at least over the past year, to thinking about choke points on technologies like semiconductors, thinking about the rare earths that help to produce so many critical technologies. But you mentioned robotics, you mentioned kind of technologies of the future as well, where I think many of us haven't placed as much thought as we should yet. So what does a choke point look like when it comes to robotics or other technologies of the future?
Well, robotics is a good example, and if you look at how the discourse around AI generally has moved this year, I think it's very revealing. So you've seen any number of figures, both US and Chinese talk about the need to focus less on AGI, on superhuman intelligence, and more on the practical applications. The Chinese term for it is embodied AI. That's now heavily pushed in Chinese official policy. And what we talk about here is the use of AI to make robots work in the real world, in particular applications, not as a universal super intelligence. So what does that look like in terms of choke points? Well, I suppose we can again take this from both ends of the stick. If we look at Southeast Asian countries, which obviously have been much a part of the discussion today, there are already Chinese robotics technologies being deployed. In Singapore, for example, they recently approved a jointly developed solution for a robotic walker for inspection of power infrastructure. Now that, you might say, is a good example of technological diffusion, but it also allows for choke points on both sides. From the Chinese side, the technology is primarily coming from a company that's based in Beijing. And from the US side, of course, you have as a single point of reference in the AI action plan that was put out by the White House in July, statements such as US technology exports, including for AI, will be subject to compliance with US security priorities and regulation. So that's an example of where a very particular use of AI in the material form, let's call it embodied AI, is a potential choke point for the providers of that tech. And the question then becomes for the party that is mainly the technology taker, which is typically the Southeast Asian countries in this context, how are you going to manage that?
So I'm glad you mentioned Chinese developers' focus on AI applications, because I want to get your thoughts on the AI race, what it means, what we're racing to. And I think a conventional wisdom is emerging, at least in Washington, that while US developers are very focused on AGI as the light at the end of the tunnel, Chinese developers are making huge progress on applications and how do we use the AI models of today in our actual lives. And so what are we racing to? Is it the same race in the US and China?
I don't think so, certainly not from the Chinese viewpoint. So China's two biggest AI companies in terms of, let's say, hardware and software, Huawei and Alibaba, both had major conferences a couple of months ago. The chairman of Alibaba explicitly said, we are not in a race to AGI. That's not the right framing for what's going on in the industry. And the chairman of Huawei said that what China needs to do is, when it comes to advanced compute, and this, what's been seen as a choke point from the US side, needs to focus on sustainable compute. Namely, Chinese industry being able to meet the development needs as articulated by the Chinese state from the resources it has despite the various constraints as a result of reliance on foreign inputs. Now, as you said, from the US side, I think that this is linked to the general discussion about AI because there's been a lot of talk this year about, let's say, the receding horizon for reaching superhuman AI. You've had very senior figures such as Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO, chairman of the National Security Commission on AI, writing op-eds saying expressly that we in the US should focus less on the race to AGI and more on essentially following what the Chinese are doing and looking at applications of AI in the everyday. And if we again come back to what it means for the third parties, in particular for the developing countries, I think that it is a very attractive proposition for countries which are mainly technology takers to be able to use technologies in the real world so that, AI, it's not an abstract thing that might be reached if we scale global compute up by a factor of 5 or 6, another $3 trillion of investment, et cetera, at some point in the undefined future. We can use it now for agricultural drones, for meteorological purposes, for medical applications, both physical surgery and diagnoses, industrial robotics, obviously. And people can see this developing quickly in China. There is still, of course, a lot of action in the Western world as well, but definitely the discussion is moving more towards, well, what does the use of AI look like in the global economy as it currently exists, rather than how might it be transformed in an undefined future?
And if you look at AI development in China, or even in Asia more broadly, what are one or two applications that appear most exciting to you? What could be most transformative?
Well, for, again, Southeast Asia as an example, I think that, again, there are cases of trials being conducted in terms of, let's say, medical applications, or elderly care is another common example, rehabilitation in terms of exoskeletons, and other aids, robotic assistance, basically, for the more disadvantaged or less able in society. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Also, obviously, for countries which still have a relative advantage in manufacturing, the rollout of industrial robotics is going to be very significant, but then that does raise the issue of, are you going to be able to compete with the mega economy? And that, of course, means China, which has the vertical integration, the economies of scale, and most of the companies which are at the forefront of at least the applications of these technologies. I should also, to round this out, say that it is certainly not the case that Chinese companies are leading comprehensively in any of these technologies, but the application is happening faster there, and the environment is more conducive to it for various reasons. So from the viewpoint of, let's say, the developed world, including the EU and Switzerland, the question will be, well, how do you find then your comparative advantage in this game, in particular with respect to the rest of the world, because China itself is now such a behemoth, juggernaut when it comes to the development and rolling out of these technologies that I think the competition there is simply going to intensify.
And so I think that you've seen some hesitance from Europe, from the US, to accept China's invitations to collaborate on AI, to think about collaborative AI governance, for example. But perhaps there could be more of a window for meaningful dialogue on managing the downside risks of AI between Washington, Brussels, Beijing. What do you see potential for any kind of cooperation between competitors?
Okay, well, in 1 minute left. From the Chinese side, the official line is that they want to work on this multilaterally. I mean, people will take it with a grain of salt, but that is their official stance, that they want this to be through the UN framework. If you look bilaterally at deals they've struck, they have MOUs with countries like Malaysia, for example, to work on co-development of AI. From the US side, I think there is interest increasingly in the sector. So Eric Schmidt, again, as an example, was at the World AI Conference in Shanghai and was also preaching a message of the need for dialogue in terms of issues like global alignment of AI as a safety issue. Again, avoiding the Terminator scenario or even less catastrophic outcomes. From the viewpoint of the US government, it is a bit difficult to see how within the current policy settings, and I've already mentioned the AI Action Plan, which are very directive in terms of countries needing to join a US-led AI alliance in order to receive US technologies. I mean, even on something like critical minerals, so-called poison clauses being included in agreements with allies like Australia, but hopefully there will also be more movement in that space in the near future.
Well, I think that's precisely our time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Right along, John, we'll see you again for the final conversation. For now, you can leave the stage. Henrietta, you may stay, and I'm asking Huong Le Thu to join us on stage for the second of the three conversations. We talked a lot about technological choke points in the first part, and now we sort of move on to sort of issues of trade and economy and how they're being weaponized for the second of the three conversations. I'll leave it to you.
Great, thank you so much. And Henrietta, I think the conversation has been so interesting on the choke points. Let's continue about that. I mean, we've been discussing almost a whole day about US engagement in Asia, how US and China are managing this very fragile relationship. So apart from what you and John just discussed about technological choke points, what are other choke points you think, either from China or other Asian countries that may throw a curveball in this all decoupling efforts?
Well, one choke point that China could wield that scares me personally is active pharmaceutical ingredients. So the US, Europe, I mean, we rely on Chinese exports to make most of our medicine, including things required for basic surgery, like anesthesia. And we've actually seen China weaponize APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, against Japan in the context of a dispute a few years ago. And within a few weeks, or maybe even less time, Japanese hospitals had to delay surgeries because they weren't able to get the medical equipment they needed. And so we haven't seen that yet in the context of the US-China trade war, but it's something that if I were in the US government, if I were sitting here in Europe, I'd be thinking very urgently about how to pursue diversification. Now, I think, unfortunately, the strategies we've heard out of Washington on this are not terribly serious. Trump has talked about tariffs on pharmaceuticals as a solution, which is not going to get us where we need to be, because it would be a sectoral tariff on the entire world. And what we would need to see is the US, Europe, like-minded countries in Asia coming together, especially with India, which is another really big pharmaceutical player, to find solutions and pursue diversification.
And what about other countries? Is there a choke point there for US?
Well, look, something I think we all learned in COVID is the profound interconnected nature of our economies. So I was sitting at the White House as director for Southeast Asia at the beginning of a few months into the COVID pandemic. And one morning I came into work and I started getting panicked calls from automakers in Detroit saying that entire factory lines were going to shut down if I couldn't reopen this one Malaysian semiconductor factory, which had shut down because of a COVID lockdown. And I was very confused about this because I hadn't realized that the US not only receives 25% of its semiconductors from Malaysia, but that each plant can be so specialized that there's no way to replace, and we're not talking about high-end stuff. This is very legacy chips. But still, the capability can be so specialized that you can't replace anything with anything else without creating massive economic dislocations, at least on a temporary basis. So I guess I say that as an example that what isn't a choke point at the end of the day? And I think we do have to be cautious as diversification becomes kind of the word of the day, that we don't decouple ourselves out of societal functionality. And so when I think about diversification, how the US, Europe, our partners in Asia can think about, what is a choke point that is unacceptable? Maybe let's think of this as a perfect world where the US maybe stops attacking our allies and we all come together and we think about what are the really unacceptable vulnerabilities to Chinese choke points. So there's some vulnerabilities that are fine. Like if China has 100% of the world market share in producing hair dryers, I don't care. That is fine. We can live without hair dryers. So that's pretty obvious. And then there are choke points on the other end of the spectrum, like APIs, pharmaceutical ingredients. So I would say that's pretty evidently unacceptable and poses a really significant risk to national security. But then there's stuff in the middle. And so how do you think about solar panels? How do you think about EV technology? Is that choke point that China is increasingly holding over the world, is that something that we must solve? Is that critical for our national security, to be able to produce the technology of tomorrow, to be able to produce the technology of the green transition in Europe and America? And I think there's where you can have an active debate.
So in the IR theory, actually, weaponized interdependence is a tool of state, and actually it could be have positive effect in which no open kinetic war is engaged, because states or competing states use this weaponized interdependence for their own advantage. So there's this tussling on the geoeconomic side rather than on the military side. And I wonder, we could call it weaponized interdependence. We could also use a simpler term of coercion as well, economic coercion. And we've had a lot of debates on Chinese coercion. I guess tariffs is another form of coercion. So how would you advise allies, partners in Asia alike to invest in their resilience against this economic coercion that may come from either major powers?
It's a great question, and one that has become much more difficult over the course of this year, where now, almost every country around the world is thinking about how they can minimize their vulnerability to economic coercion from China and economic coercion from the US, and doing both of those things at the same time. It's not impossible, but it's a really hard job. I think that step one is kind of going through the taxonomy that I raised earlier. So every country needs to understand for itself which choke points it can live with, which vulnerabilities are kind of maybe purely economic, purely of convenience, and then which incur unacceptable national security consequences or vulnerabilities. And so every country will do that math in their own way, but the only way you can solve for any of these vulnerabilities is through really deliberate collaboration among like-minded countries. And so and you could see some kind of funny coalitions coming out of this. I wouldn't be surprised if countries in the Indo-Pacific still come to the US for support diversifying certain supply chains away from China. Thinking, for example, of the countries in Southeast Asia that have experienced kind of generation one of Chinese economic coercion, the pre-rare earths era, but more of the we're not going to buy your bananas because we don't like your South China Sea policy. I could still see the US playing a pretty significant role in that kind of diversification, but then at the same time, those same countries are trying to diversify away from the US market. And there'll be a different set of partners for that. So, over the course of the day, we've talked about kind of the multi-alignment strategy that, maybe most famously India, but also many countries in Southeast Asia are most comfortable pursuing. And so now I think you'll see that approach increasingly layered onto their strategies for minimizing economic vulnerabilities as well.
And to flip that, on the other hand, it is also a game of diminishing returns, isn't it? There's geoeconomic tools that is being played at pleasure of the leaders now, but it carries not only long-term economic repercussions, it's also affecting overall power. So United States, perhaps soft power, reputation, you name it, will have a hit in Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in Europe here as well, something that may last well beyond Trump. And I wonder what is your advice if they are listening to you now? What is your advice on that?
Well, I would say, we saw the public opinion numbers on the U.S. and China. The U.S. numbers fall precipitously at the beginning of this year. I mean, that's not uniquely a Trump phenomenon. That's not uniquely a tariff phenomenon. Traditionally, allies and partners in Asia, and I don't mean this as a political thing, but just reflecting public opinion data, they like Democrats, they don't like Republicans in office. And I think it's because Democrats often, at least speak the language of rules-based order, multilateral institutions, supporting our allies and partners in a way that's more comfortable than kind of the Republican rhetorical diction, even if the actual underlying policy isn't always so different, maybe this year being an exception where the policy was very different. So, you do see ups and downs, and the China numbers are often kind of inverse to the change in U.S. public opinion. So, after the U.S. Eliminated our development agency earlier this year, there was a question of, is China going to fill the gap? Is this an opportunity for China to step up and fund all these health, education, climate programs that the U.S. has been supporting around the world? And my assumption has been, in some cases, China will fill the gap. In most cases, it will not. And China will get the benefits anyway, because China is seen as a foil to the U.S. when the U.S. makes these kind of catastrophic breaches of trust in its partnerships. And I think that is something that the U.S. will not fully recover from, within a generation at least, because it's not just that the U.S. imposed these huge tariffs, the U.S. withdrew development assistance. It's that it was a surprise, it wasn't explained, it seemed somewhat arbitrary. And the most important responsibility the US has, if it wants to be seen as a credible partner in Asia, is to be able to say credibly to our allies and partners, we are here for the long term, this is what we're doing, to be predictable, to deliver value over time. Because China doesn't have to prove that. China's always here. China's a geographic reality. The US has to prove that we are long-term, reliable partners. And so you can't do that in only one part of the relationship. Like, the US has invested significantly in some of our military ties in the region, but that's not enough if you're breaking faith in such a catastrophic way with these tools of economic coercion and economic weaponization.
Well, I hope they're listening, but that's all the time we have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. Huong may stay, and I'm asking John back for this very final conversation. We started the day asking what the state of the world was, and Suhasini and Pita kind of gave us this broad-ranging view, and I think in a way we're returning to this conversation because we are clearly in a time of weaponized interdependence. That seems obvious. What's a lot less obvious to me is what this means, right? Are we seeing, Huong made the point, maybe this is actually a good thing, because as long as there's weaponized interdependence, there's not, weaponized weapons, I guess, which is preferable. But then there's also, of course, the problem that when these tools of coercion increase and countries actually start to decouple from each other more, then the efficiency of the economic tools degrades, and then that might actually lead to kinetic warfare. So, what, if anything, can we say on where we're going, and so what kind of world? I hesitate to use the word order, but just kind of what world are we heading towards with this idea of weaponized interdependence and geoeconomics? Please.
All right, 10 minutes. So perhaps since India has already been discussed today, and I believe that both our areas are very Southeast Asia-centric, I'll focus on the ASEAN countries. Of course, Trump, as again we've covered today, has recently done his tour. I'd be interested in your view on bringing it back to Europe. How do you see a pattern, if any, in how Southeast Asian countries are dealing with this issue, particularly of weaponized interdependence?
Well, I think the recognition is that geopolitics and geoeconomics are actually not divorced from each other. It's again, one way or another, or the card in the negotiation table. And I think for this particular state of U.S. foreign policy or an economic policy under President Trump's second term. We saw that played out very clearly, and a lot has been discussed about this, Trump's meeting with Xi, deals struck there, but also with other Asian leaders. But to me, it was a meeting between a statesman and a businessman, where negotiating on a small, short-term deals may have impact on long-term geopolitics. So even, we mentioned Taiwan was not discussed, and a lot of Asian actors in the region, including Southeast Asian, including, not uncommon in Southeast Asia, to think about some sort of secret negotiation between the G2, but at the same time, lack of discussion on that may also build up to a certain result. If Trump is not interested in geopolitics or long-term, whether Taiwan or South China Sea, Xi Jinping remains interested, right? And perhaps short-term deals that he feels as a win, he can claim 12 of 10, can also, in a cumulative and aggressive manner, change the balance of power there. So I think for Southeast Asia, geopolitics and geoeconomics are not divorced from each other. It was never even, China for economics, the US for security, that was a perception, but the truth was it was always interconnected, and it is even more so now.
Yes, there was an interesting piece in The Diplomat not so long ago arguing that actually for Vietnam, as an example, China is the important security partner and the US is the economic partner. And again, to quote an oft-heard saying about Vietnam, every Vietnamese leader needs to be both able to stand up to China and to, of course, to cooperate with China. So then, perhaps among the countries of Southeast Asia, would you see a distinction in how countries are approaching this problem? Of course, we know that ASEAN is one of the most diverse regions in the world in terms of the wealth and level of development between the different countries.
So China will use all tools of state power, whether it's economic or military. And we've seen that, Henrietta mentioned the banana cases or mango cases that were boycotted from Philippines when anytime the disputes on the South China Sea emerges, and Vietnam is not disfamiliar to that either. So I think, again, that point proves the point that for countries in Southeast Asia, geoeconomics and geopolitics are not separate things. In fact, economics will stronger economics built into stronger resilience of a country. Without good economics, you cannot invest in good armies and buy expensive weapons that President Trump's administration is urging everybody to do. And it's a simple enabling case as well. So I think strong, resilient economies build strong national security as well. So for Southeast Asia, it's not a matter of national security in the military sense and economic security. Everything is a comprehensive security. And I think that was for a long, long time, Henrietta mentioned that was a criticism of US engagement in the region that lacks that economic pillar, lacks that enabling, it was IPEF, which in the Pacific Economic Framework under Biden was very weak and not very beneficial for Southeast Asia. But now with tariffs, almost everyone is wishing it is coming back again. So I guess for Southeast Asia in general, but I guess all the developing countries, South Asia included, economies and development is an enabler of security. Mm.
Perhaps again, to bring Europe into the picture, this being the final session of the day, I think it's useful for the comparison since we are here. Do you see the potential for intra-regional cooperation, let's say within ASEAN, to address some of these issues? Because certainly as someone who looks at the supply chain issues, one of the challenges that you often come across is, again, that different level of development between ASEAN countries and the fact that many of them compete with each other. If we talk about the chip industry, for example, the reality is that Singapore and Malaysia are more advantaged for historical reasons. You have another couple of countries, mainly Vietnam, which have some advantage in terms of getting on this ladder. And it's very difficult to see how the rest will share in the gains, whether the partner is China or the United States.
There's a level of competition even within Southeast Asian countries because some of them have very similar portfolio in terms of manufacturing. There's a level of competition when it comes to attracting foreign investment from Europe or East Asian economies, or even United States, or private investments as well. So there is a level of competition among ASEAN economies as well. There is a renewed or increased need to come up with strategies for the whole region, especially after Trump's tariffs. This had been the project within ASEAN for decades. Great, intra-ASEAN trade and market and whatnot. It's been a very long and a lengthy process of negotiation that hasn't really resulted in much of opening of the intra-ASEAN market. The level of intra-ASEAN trade more or less traded the same over the last few decades. It was the outside trade with China, with other countries, that really grew up in the Southeast Asian region. But I think there is a need now, of course. Countries are looking, those who had been looking for diversification, like Vietnam had already set up entries to European markets and European free trade arrangements, and those who haven't really are now having the urge to explore that because of simply the need for export markets. What I would say also is that for Southeast Asia, I think it is going to be a challenging time. One is China is looking to expand its export to Southeast Asia. We've heard that already. And there's a great fear of dumping and kind of other flooding the market, because the production in Southeast Asia will not match the one of China in terms of prices as well. So it's also a challenge for domestic markets and domestic production. Some of the countries have taken steps, like Indonesia, but others have not. And the really great fear is not just whether there is policy in place, but implementation, and then really how countries will filter out the Chinese products without also jeopardizing their diplomatic relations with China.
Sure, then maybe to tie it all together with a couple of minutes plus left, would you say, keeping the focus on ASEAN, that perhaps third parties like the European Union really provide an alternative partner? Because the heart of the weaponized interdependence problem is that you rely basically on one actor for the critical input. That's the whole concept of a choke point, that you don't have alternatives. So from what you see in terms of various Southeast Asian countries' engagement, can Europe, as, let's say, the largest single alternative pole of technology, of foreign investment, perhaps even of human capital, really provide, at some level, an alternative to the US and China, even if it's not a direct substitute?
It's a little bit harder because US, EU or European standards are often higher bracket for that is not often easily met by many of Southeast Asian countries, and there would be a little bit of competition there as well, because there's unequal in every domain almost in terms of development, in terms of standards and norms, whether it's tech or other aspects. But I would still say that Southeast Asia should remain important for Europe. One, for the potential and the market that Peter have also already highlighted yesterday. Indeed, post-COVID, it is Southeast Asia that is going to drive Asia-Pacific growth and recovery. And I would also say that because of this demographic dividend, Southeast Asia, consciously or not, will drive a lot of norms and standards by simply algorithms. The technological adoption, the usage of technology, AI. You said that yourself. It is also about usage that is driving the standard up. Southeast Asia will have a big say in terms of shaping the norms and and the future of AI, not because they have very ready technological base to start from, but from the algorithm and usage. And many countries already include AI in their education. Some have bigger ambitions in that, and so it will be ingrained from very early on.
Okay, well, thank you for that very interesting conversation. I think we'll all watch this space for a long time to come.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.